Hello, everyone. Welcome to School After Hours podcast, where staff, administrators, and families keep their finger on the pulse of the wonderful world of OST programming, aka out of school time programming. I am your host, Jay Lee, and today we have the amazing Kam Green on the show. She is an out of school time program developer, a professional development coach, a program evaluator, and entrepreneur. Kam has 15 years of experience working in the out-of-school time programming field. She started as a part-time worker, and now she is an entrepreneur in the OST programming space. So for this show, I thought it would be best to talk about the strategies that can help develop the best practices for out-of-school time programs and why program evaluations are important. But before we jump into the interview, let's go into our Community Corner. Community Corner is a new segment to the show that allows guests or myself to share tips, advice, or information about the OST field with families, youth, and community members. For this episode's Community Corner, I asked Kam, what are some things you would like to share with parents when it comes to engaging with their kids and technology? Here was her response.
3 things I would share with parents from a perspective of after school or out of school time, because a lot of parents have been operating in the space of teacher and after school teacher over the last year. But even when your kids are at home, like what can you do? What can you be doing? What should you be doing? And so I'll speak the technology piece, because technology and having your kid on technology is a huge thing. And so I talk to parents all the time, and they're constantly stressed. They're stressed about the amount of time their child is spending in front of a screen, the amount of time their child is connected, right? And so, yes, we don't want our kids tied to technology all the time, but we also have to look at the society we live in, the type of systems and tools that our kids are using. Is not the worst thing, because one, it means they can acclimate, shift, and pivot and use the resources that are being used in the world. Right? So if they're not able and they're not capable of, oh yeah, do this, do here, go here, close this link, which so many kids are, then it puts them at the deficit. So we don't want them to be on the opposite end where they can't hop into these systems, navigate, pull up a few things. And then obviously we don't want them to be on the extreme where it's all the time. But one of the things that I tell parents is to consider this is the day and age we live in. We're a more tech connected society. And so to some degree, we do want our kids to be able to engage in that, right? And the other thing is to relieve some of the stress for yourself about your child being on technology all the time. Acknowledge for yourself and your child what great things have come out of them being connected. Whether it's learning new skills, like there have been times where I've had my own kids, they troubleshooted something for me. They were able to, oh, here, you need to do this. Oh, this is how you go into this, right? And one particular thing I'll say in general is I remember during the pandemic being like, oh my goodness, my kids are just online, the YouTube, video games. I'm like, oh my goodness. I was at that point too. And then one day my son comes down and he's like, hey, I want to make this recipe that my favorite gamer YouTube was making. And he makes this fried chicken recipe that is better than mine. And I'm thinking, wow, that's amazing. And yes, some of them, it's all about one thing and it's very limiting. But here it is that he's watching these videos and he's engaging and spending hours and hours and hours. And then one of the things that was cool for me is he took away a recipe that he didn't just see, he actually wanted to do it. He wanted to create it. So he was inspired by that. And so I think that you have to think about what are some positives that are coming out of it. They're not always online. They're doing other stuff. And the pandemic was a unique situation. So of course there was more time, but now they're starting to get back into the world. When they're at school, they are doing other stuff. They are engaged in other activities. And then prior to the pandemic, they also were. So I would challenge people to come away from the phrase that they're always on there, because that's, always and never. We try not to use those words. And then 2, if you're stressed out about it, think more about some of the great things that are coming out about it or could come out of it. So if they're always on there, how can you use it and how can you leverage it and how can you name it for them? I was like, I'm so impressed, And so over even the last year, all of my kids have taken away something that's been really useful. And then something even like added meal or recipe, there's been great added value for the family, right? So that's my piece or my thought on always being on technology. Just trying to shift the perspective of how you think about it, right?
So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Kam, and she's going to give us some information about herself. Tell us a little bit, Miss Kam, about how you got involved in after-school programming and just how you came into this career altogether.
Hi, my name is Kam, and I am the founder of Rethink After School, and I'm so happy to be here having this conversation today. I love all things after school. So after college, I started working for an arts education program in Chicago. And what the program did, it was called Urban Gateway Center for Arts Education. And what we did as a program was we found artists to go into schools to do like artist in residency programs where they would spend time in Chicago public schools. We also partnered with businesses, donors, et cetera, to give like tickets to low income schools and populations where they could go see live theater and live programs and things like that. They work with groups, the Chicago Theater, Alvin Ailey, bringing Alvin Ailey to the school or getting the students to go see that. And so it was such an amazing opportunity. It's funny because when I was in college, everybody was like, oh, you should go into teaching, you should go into teaching. And I'm like, I'm not going into teaching. I'm not going into teaching. Leave me alone, And after college, I actually was getting ready to do a grad program. I don't want to do that. So I, started working with this organization. And that was kind of my first professional jump into working with after school. Now I worked more in the office space. So that's in the classroom, with the students, but behind the scenes coordinating, working with the executive director, figuring out stuff with the board and, all that kind of stuff. I saw all the stuff that was, kind of coming together and being put out there. And as I began to work there, I started to get more interest in actually me being a part of, delivering and connecting. And so that was kind of the segue, right? And then I started doing my own programming, going into schools and kind of doing little workshops about motivation, different things like that. And then a few years later, I actually started teaching. I started working for this charter school. So after I fought, I started working for this charter school, and which they had in their charter, it was 2 teachers in every classroom. So teacher assistant. I got the opportunity to be a TA for a program. And so I'm in the classroom working in things like that. And then at the same time, I got an opportunity to work part-time after school, in the after school program. And then what that caused me to do was start to think about how can I take more of what's happening during the day and put that into after school. But then also, how can I conversations connecting of the people who are working during the day with the people after school? Because definitely like we're over here and you're over there, right? But because I was working in both spaces, I was usually a part of both those conversations. So I had like a unique opportunity. The staff that I work with, they were usually just coming in for after school, maybe a subbing or something like that. So my transition into it was kind of that, being in the class actually made me want to work after school more because I wanted to do more in that space. I'm like, this is, there's so much more that can be happening here that we can't do during the day where we creatively after school. There's so much more that we could be grabbing from the teachers and communicating. And then it just became, a little bit more of a thirst. And then I was offered a role to completely take over the extended day program at the school I worked with and then not be in there fully, right? So I left the classroom. I went over to that after school space completely. And I have worked, the last 15, 16 years, and it's been my full-time, overtime thing. And then sometimes it's been that I'm just, teaching school classes or I'm just, doing professional development. But, since as a professional, I have been engaged in after school and I've loved it.
In that process of coming into the after school space, what made you decide to go on your own and start rethinking after school?
So it was really a transition. being able to take over the program at that school, and it wasn't a lot of stuff built out. It was just kind of, hey, you make it up, you figure it out. I just started to think, these programs can be more. You hear about after school, and it has such a bad name. At that time, I didn't have kids, but even from what I would hear from parents when I was working in the classroom, they'd be like, oh, well, it was kind of a dreadful thing, like parents sending their kids to the after school program. They were like, oh, I have to send them to after school. And it seemed like almost they were in a rush to get them out of this situation. And I'm like, what's happening after school? So, but the thing is that nothing was happening sometimes, right? They weren't doing anything. They weren't engaging in anything. They were just kind of sitting around. And if you have, especially parents who want their kids in activities, but don't maybe have the capacity, it'd be nice if they were in a program that was doing things. And so it just got me to start thinking that it's not that hard to engage, have some meaningful programs. And when you come to pick your kid up from after school, maybe they were excited. Maybe they learned something. Maybe they took something away. Maybe they got to do a cool activity. And it wasn't just them, sit down, do your homework, go over there. It wasn't this kind of contentious thing. And a lot of times it felt like that was kind of the word on the street, right? And that after school didn't have that. So I've seen so much growth and change in that conversation in the last 10 years. But that seemed to be the thing, let's say, late 90s, early 2000s, and things like that. Parents were just like, for the most part, dreading sending their kids to after school. And I thought, it doesn't have to be that way for anybody, and that's what made me start rethinking after school and thinking about what little programs can I throw in and engage in whatever we have, whatever resources we have that makes this time more, more meaningful. And that kind of sparked that for me.
Awesome. For those of us that may not know, tell us about Rethinking After School and what it does.
So Rethink After School is after school professional development, curriculum development, an advocate of policy that supports out of school time, from funding, from getting laws in place to ensure that every child has access to after school. So have developed programs from STEAM to theater to writing to entrepreneurship. And the idea of the programs is that I go off of 4 words. They should be engaging, enriching, educational, and entertaining. So that's always kind of the 4 overarching components that I'm thinking about when I'm developing a program or engaging in a program. Does it have that educational something they can take away, right? Does it have that entertaining? Can they have fun? Is it engaging? Are they going to be looking at me like they're watching wet paint dry? So those are critical to me. And then taking that same thing and putting that into professional development. I think definitely in the last 7 years, we've seen a shift, but there wasn't specific professional development for people who worked in after school, not a broad range. You got the, National After School Alliance, and you got associations who have been thinking about it, but it was, very narrow. And even people who working in after school, they sometimes, it was kind of, siloed. But now I've definitely seen growth in that. I'm happy. But yes, that's one of the things that I said I wanted to do. I'm developing professional development for people who work after school. Right. It speaks to what we're dealing with after school, from 10 kids getting dropped because their parents didn't come pick them up. And even though they're not supposed to be here because they're not on our roster, here they are. Right. You can't do that during the regular day. You can't just throw some kids from somewhere. Oh, I didn't have daycare. They're going to be in your class for the day.
Right, here you go.
But after school, that is the reality, right? That is the reality. And so that's what I thought. I'm like, I need to build professional development that speaks to these situations, that we're dealing with, as opposed to sort of a blanket level thing, because it's different, it's a lot different. So that's what I aim to do. And that's what I have done the last several years, and just, continuing to be thoughtful about it and not just ever going with the status quo. And that's why that word came to mind. It's a constant rethink after school. That means that at night, should it just be the same? It's like, okay, well, something has altered. Now we're dealing with the pandemic. Okay. Yeah. Rethink after school. Okay, well, now we're looking at, budget crunch. Okay, and now it's time to rethink how we're delivering these programs with less resources. So that phrase, to me, that it just resonates in my head. It's like, keep rethinking. Let's keep rethinking. So that's what Rethink After School is. And, it's a labor of love, and, again, something that I have engaged with sometimes full time and overtime. And then sometimes I'm doing it more, on a smaller scale, but always rethinking.
I know that's right. I know that is the truth, especially with the way that things are changing so rapidly now with the pandemic, like you mentioned, but also the range that we have for professional development. Because, like you said, that there was a time when there really wasn't anything that was detailed for us. So we're out here just trying to figure it out as we go. Like, how we gonna do this? What we gonna do? What money
Yeah.
do we have to do all this?
And I think part of that, and I always said, and I say now, it made it feel like after school was an afterthought, right? And it wasn't something that could be a contributor to success. And I'm like, wait, what? I'm like, that's the complete opposite. And so I feel like that was another thing. Well, why isn't there professional development to develop the people who are working with them? Why? Because it's an afterthought. Oh, they don't need that. Oh, they're kind of over here, as opposed to making that a priority. And so that was important to me and still is important to me.
Right. And thank you for creating that avenue for professionals in this space to kind of build their craft and what they love and what they do. So thank you for your service and all that you do and your creativity.
Thank you. I love it. I love it.
So my next question for you is program evaluations. Why are program evaluations important and what do you look for when you evaluate a program?
So, program evaluations are important because they help to, set a standard of some sort. I think one of the things as we talk about moving towards quality, and again, there's been lots of growth in that area, is that okay? Well, what does that look like? And so I think if we want to step up and we want to be considered this high echelon of opportunity for students, then we have to say, okay, we're willing to be evaluated against what that looks like. So being able to determine what does success look like? What do best practices look like? When a child is in a great program, what is the outcome? And there are lots of things that you can look at, indicators from their social emotional to their academic to maybe their attendance, well-being, mood, fitness. There's lots of indicators and things that you can look at to say, well, if they had not come here, they wouldn't have gotten, 10 minutes of this. If they would not have come here, they would not have gotten an opportunity to participate in this activity because maybe it was a transportation issue for parents to do something outside of the school, or maybe it was a funding thing, right? Which is often a issue for parents that they can't afford to put their child into these extracurricular activities. So if you can create that for them there and give them that, that's a heck of a value add. Like that's something that you want to be able to look at. It's these opportunities saying I have got an opportunity to do, and for me, when I started working in the space, and I'm like, I say now, I'm like, wait, I am after school. I am a product of after school. I grew up in after school programs, camps, and all that kind of stuff. And so it just started to kind of click. And I'm like, if these kind of things didn't exist, I would have had half the opportunities I could have had. And my parents had no money. So like these were critical.
Yep. And I completely believe in that for my personal experience because I'm a after school baby as well. And if it wasn't for programs like Carter G. Woodson, if it wasn't for programs like Boys and Girls Club, I do not know like the enrichment that I experienced from those programs and even learning how to be social, and going out and trying new things and being in new environments and learning how to navigate in those areas. If I didn't have that coaching present, if I didn't have, those people and those mentors present to kind of pour into me, I don't know what my life experience would have been like. So yep. After school programming is very important, and I'm happy that it's starting to get the recognition that it is. But also, in the same breath, I hope it continues to get the funding that it needs
Yeah.
in order to go in that direction of, professional development for not just the providers and the people that are doing the work, but also for the organizations as well to keep
Yeah.
them up and running and stable.
Yeah. And I think that that's another good piece about doing evaluations and things like that. Sometimes they can be, a pain, and depending on whether you're having to develop them and, how you decide to roll them out, it takes manpower and things like that. But you want your evidence. You want to be able to say, hey, this is what we did. Did X amount of this. We did this many things, this many hours. We affected this many students. We have this much data or little quotes and snippets we can get from students to say how they're being affected and engaged in a positive way through this program. And so you're like, hey, give me some more money, fund me,
Right.
because I can show you, as opposed to not being able to back And there are lots of, funding methods where you have to have that data. And when you're going for grants and things like that, you have to be able to show it. So it's like, as we get to that space where we want to be seen even more as these quality measuring these quality programs, then we have to get into that league where we're saying, okay, now here's the evidence of why, and it's not saying that everything's going to be perfect or 100% or anything like that, because that's not the reality. But even I feel like, I'm huge on evaluations just in general. And I do evaluations with my kids. I let them evaluate me just to kind of understand, because there's times where it has nothing to do with funding, but it's like, oh, we've been doing this program and nobody likes it. Or we've been doing this program and it doesn't fit, whatever. So it's like, you have to stop and kind of say, okay, is this working? Is this doing well, or is it not working? And then kind of move forward, as opposed to just keep going, just because. And so I think that's another thing about evaluations. It forces you to stop, because it may say, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. Instead, we're going to do this, or we're going to say, we definitely are keeping this. This has been, great. So I think it's nice too, just from, an internal perspective, even if you're not sharing it for funding, to say, okay, hey team, this is what we need to do. So it's a good measure and a good roadmap, is what I think of when I think about evaluations.
Right. And it gives you a point of, like you said, going back into best practices. What are we doing that's working well and that we need to keep? But what is going down the toilet? Like, what do we need to scrap?
Yep. Yep.
And figure out something else better to do, because this just ain't cutting it right here. Like this right here, no, we need something different. We need something different. And students will tell you that. They will tell you, like, this is not it. And too often, I don't feel like we give them enough credit, but we also don't provide the space for them to give their feedback. And they're the ones that's participating in the program, giving them an opportunity to share their opinions or even give their input on suggestions of what we can do differently, because it's their program too.
Yes, I'm shaking my head profusely in one of my workshops, Rethink After School, how to create a program that gets and keeps kids engaged. I have like 30 things that I go through. And one of them, I think it's probably in the top 5, is do not build a program without your students' input. There should always be some kind of, feedback. And for me, when I used to have a full staff, I would just just ask them. How did you all feel about that? It doesn't always have to be this big, oh, we're going to send out a survey and everybody log on, you're going to do a form. You can get just some verbal data and make some notes in real time and quick action. I'm like, even when I'm teaching, if I'm looking at people and I'm reading the room and I'm like, crickets, or people are kind of, and I'm like, hey, how's everybody doing? Is everybody getting this? Is this making sense? And then somebody might say, Cam, Miss Cam, you lost me. Okay. But if I didn't stop to take that quick, whatever, or, oh, this is kind of, and kids, they'll say this, oh, this is kind of boring. Okay. I can take it. Let me think about a different way to engage, or how would you do it? And maybe they don't know, but it's like, you need to hear that to kind of consider it and say, okay, well, that wasn't as engaging as I thought it was. I thought it was great, but they didn't. And it's like, so how can I look at that next time? And sometimes when you ask kids on the spot, they might not be able to answer, but you can follow up and say, I appreciate you being honest. If you think of some other things, or what are some, games or some ways that you've done it, tell me. Tell me so I can do that and so I can incorporate that. Don't just go off and just plan this whole great thing you think and never involve the people who it's supposed to serve, because that's a disservice. And it makes it harder for you, because you're designing something based on your thoughts, which could be great, but they're not accurate when you're not, taking in your population that's in front of you. That's why I was just like, yes, please talk to these students, please involve them at the end of the year planning, when you're kind of thinking about what you're going to do next year, involve them daily while you're in the middle of a lesson. Is this going well? Are we doing, okay? Don't leave them out of the conversation, because, it impacts your program and it impacts what they're going to get out of it.
Exactly. We'll dive a little bit more into that a little bit into the interview when it comes to youth voice, because that is important. So hold on to that thought. Because we're going to come back to that. My next question for you is, once you evaluate a program, how do you begin to coach the staff as well as the organization to meet their short-term as well as long-term goals?
I think that for me, it's always about, because I think when people go through evaluation, sometimes it can be, a painstaking kind of thing. And then also sometimes it feels like it's going to be more work. Right. And so they're like, oh, we did these evaluations. Now we had to change all this stuff, or now we had to do all this stuff. And so I'm always trying to find the simple and easy route. So always trying to find the simple and easy route. So as opposed to saying, oh, we're going to create all this new stuff, it's like, let's figure out what we have and what we're working with. It's not about going out and creating and reinventing the wheel, but it's like, let's figure out what we have and let's figure out what we can do within that. And so I'm always trying to share that when I'm doing professional development and stuff like that. Let's tap inside and let's just kind of polish what we have. Let's shave off, a little bit what we have, or let's see how we can pivot. So really looking at that instead of saying, oh, we got to get a whole new curriculum, or we got to get a whole new staff. No, maybe they're not engaging and maybe they don't. But how about we do 15 minutes a week where we practice engagement tips. We give some, so thinking about those small little things that you can do to engage. And I always like to start with no money, right? So things that you can do that don't cost anything, because that's easier. And then things you can incorporate into what you're already doing. Because again, once an evaluation happens, it's usually follow up or needs to be followed up with some kind of action, right? So like, okay, we said this is working on this and that. So now what are we going to do? So instead of creating another meeting or another this, or think you need that, sometimes you do. But start with, what can we do with the space that we're already working with? So can we use 10 minutes in our current meeting to discuss this one thing that we're really struggling at and do a micro lesson? Okay. So now every meeting, we're going to talk about this for 10 minutes. So now people are building capacity, right? You definitely have to think about a plan. You have to think about your resources, and you have to think about how you can roll it out in a way that makes sense and that's not overwhelming to the staff and allows you that sort of progress and small chunk growth, as opposed to, all right, we got to throw this whole program in the trash, and start over. Because there's always going to be something that we need to fix or we're not doing well, but we can't let it overwhelm us and take drastic measures and treating it like it's a fire.
Exactly. And you touched on a very good point, and also a nerve for some people when it comes to planning lessons or activity plans, is what I like to call it. Because so when you hear lesson plans, I've had experiences where teachers or counselors in after school programming are like, lesson plans. I'm not an educator. I was like, so technically you do fall on the education spectrum. I don't know if you know that. It might not be in full form classroom form, but know that when you are signing up for after school programming, you are treating the whole child. That's not just their academics, that is their physical health, that's their mental and emotional health, but also their character at the same time. But that requires planning.
Yep.
So
lesson plans are the woo. They can definitely be a point of contention for teams getting those lesson plans done.
So, what do you suggest when it comes to planning lessons? What can frontline professionals with the students every day, where can they pull from to kind of create their lesson plans? And what should they include in their plans?
So, I mean, now with the internet, thank you for the internet, there's lots of things that you can pull. There's lots of resources out there, and there's lots of stuff that has already been done. For one of the things I think about lesson plans is that when you can think about it in a sort of a broad strategic way, it's important to be organized. So if Ms. Kam is making some lessons for kindergarten for this year around whatever, they should be available to the kindergartners for next year. So you shouldn't, it shouldn't be that every year people are creating new plans, right? At this point, there should be some kind of place to document and organize those kind of things. And then with lesson plans, again, keep it easy. So I have a sort of a 4-point thing that I do with lessons, and it's lesson planning. And so I use a method or, phrases, and it's called ask, correct, engage, connect. So the ask is get the kids talking. Correct is if they're saying something wrong and way off, you say, oh, well, great answers, but this is what it is. Engage is whatever you're talking about. Let's do something where we can, create something, do something with our hands, or, move around or something. And then the last piece is connect. How can I connect what we just taught to something that's meaningful to you in real life, a book, a movie? Oh, that happened to my sister. Oh, whatever. And so that's how I plan my lesson. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna ask a question. I'm going to correct them. I'm going to have some little activity. And then at the end, I'm going to have them connected to something in real life. That's my lesson. Boom. And so when I talk to people about creating lessons, I'm like, you should be able to create a lesson based on that, like at anything. I should be able to throw something at you and you say, okay, hey, what do you know about the bones? Okay, great. Can anybody else tell me anything? Well, actually, we have bones to keep our body together. Let me tell you a few more facts. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to touch our bones. We're going to, and then lastly, what can you tell me about the bones? Have you ever got a cast? Have you, and then you keeping that conversation going. That's my lesson. I'm done.
Right.
So, simple, I think one of the biggest barriers for people, like you said, with people creating lesson plans is one, maybe they weren't expecting to have to do that. They don't see themselves as educators. But I've seen some calls for lesson plans that they're just too complicated. It requires a lot of time, it requires a lot of input, and it requires a lot of stuff. And it could be, a burden. So I feel like one, if you're going to do those kind of things, you need to have group times where you're kind of planning and throwing out working, turn part of your meeting into a working lesson plan meeting where people can sit down and say, okay. Or two, how can you strip it down to make it a little bit easier in those kind of things and have some set standards for your programs? Like, we're always going to make sure we touch on some SEL topics. We're always going to make sure we have a fitness component. And then that way it's not every time they have to go in, well, this was the objective. This was, like when you can have sort of some things, hey, we know we're doing this and our objective is always to engage, enrich, educate, entertain, and then this is the topic, bones. They don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. And it takes away some of that administrative labor and frustration. And they can really just be very quick. So again, that's why I go with those 4 things, because I'm like, boom, boom, boom. And, and that's it. And then at the bottom, what materials are needed to produce to make what you said happen?
Right. It does. It definitely does. Especially if you're planning in groups instead of doing it individually. I find out that it goes a little bit smoother based on the last site that I was at. Them teaming up was very helpful because then they just started to recycle the lessons and make adjustments where needed be for their
Yep.
age group. Which I was like, look, if that's less work for y'all, I support it. If it's
That's huge.
completing the goal, you know what I mean? As far as them learning something and able to relate it back to life, then hey, you have done more than your job. Congratulations. Y'all have figured it out. Now I just need y'all to keep it up.
Yeah. And that's a great opportunity too. And I've done that before with programs where it's like, okay, here's the theme and the lesson for the week. And then all you need to do is come up with a variation. So if you're doing preschool, you might have to sing a little bit with it. If you're doing high school, they might not want that. So
Right.
take that out. But it's like, and then it allows for cross, collaboration and communication, even among the students. Oh, we talked about that this week too. But they, if you're in 8th grade, you're talking about it at a different level than a kindergartner, but you're still, getting it. And I think all programs should, operate at that level, because it puts everybody on the same page too. You might be a little, want to divert here and there, but if like everybody kind of is going on the same theme across the months, it just makes it a lot easier. We're all having the same conversation as opposed to, what are you working on? What are you working on? Oh, I'm over here.
Right.
It just makes for a lot of noise sometimes.
Don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to.
Do not.
That brings me to my next question for you. What changes do you see happening in after school programming based on the pandemic? And what do you think that we need to do to stay afloat to make sure that we're doing more than surviving in the game?
I think I see a greater value from a lot of places being placed on after school, because when the pandemic hit, after school was like, everything was after school. Everything was out of school time because everybody was out of school. And so there was this kind of thirst for like, okay, well, what do I do when my kids are out of school? What does this time look like? Kind of thing. And so it was almost like, hey, here we are in the limelight, yay. So I think that was something positive that came out of that. But then also the call for, okay, let's think about what's happening. Let's make sure that it's intentional, it's engaging, and things like that, right? So that was the good thing. On the bad side, obviously, the negatives, the funding where you can't, come in person. Programs are shutting down, staff. I had a couple of programs going on in a couple different states that ceased to exist because they're not bringing people back in, and they just didn't want to do the virtual option. So I think that presents a very real consider of how we're engaging students after school in the midst of, a pandemic and medical things and things like that. But in terms of staying afloat, I think that it's about just consistently having the conversation and consistently showing that what we do matters. What we do is important. After school is not an afterthought. Look at how we are wrapping ourselves around these students. Look at how important and critical this is for families. that we have this, that we engage. And one of the things that I have been talking about a lot lately is after school sports, because I feel like a lot of the private programs are getting increasingly expensive, competitive in a way that kind of blocks out a lot of kids. And, after school programs is a great space for students to be able to engage in sports, to learn about different kinds of sports, and to be able to get that team building, feel comfortable to maybe go join another team if they want to do it more competitively. But there's so much opportunity that we can support these students. So there needs to be funding for that. Providing quality programming, providing the funding for after school programming could provide a constant that could be critical, to so many kids, and provide them with that change and that constant, that they need, and that community that they need to thrive. With all this other stuff going on, it's like, can we make these hubs, these community, programs, these after schools, these places where kids can come and they can connect, they can grow, they can get some homework help, they can have some fun, they can have a trusted partner, or somebody they can talk to, a safe space, food, all these kind of things. And I'm like, after school has always been one of those kind of things, and it has to be continued to seen as one of those things. And we have to really think about how can we get the most out of this time. And that requires money. That requires that the funding be there to pay people to run the programs, that people deserve to be paid. I always say in education, it shouldn't be that, oh, you didn't go into education for the money. Well, you could have, why not? I mean, you're training the people, and you're raising the people, and you're churning out the people who are making all this money. So why wouldn't you have an opportunity to make good money too, and to make lots of money? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So I think that definitely has to be considered. And I think if people start looking at it as this opportunity to provide consistency and a constant in a world that is, constantly up and down, whether it's a pandemic or just, a regular day, in life can be kind of up and down. That's going to be the thing that keeps it going. But I feel confident, now, especially with what I've seen in the last 10, 15 years, just with the voices and the people that are working in after school. I'm like, these people are amazing. Like, and it didn't always used to be that way. I didn't used to always look around and say that. I used to be like, woo, we're going to get through this day. We're accelerating, and we're kind of out there more, and people are starting to be more attracted and aware, what's going on. And so, more people are saying, hey, I could work in after school. Because I think that's another thing too, is that, you don't see it as maybe a full-time career or something where you could, sustain yourself. And it's like, it's plenty of stuff, plenty of spaces to engage. We need people on this side, on this side, this side. And so I think as we get more out there, it's like, I love looking around and seeing the people that are working, in these spaces now. And I'm like, these are some amazing people. And so I think that that's going to be the drive, because these amazing people are creating amazing structures and programs and putting systems that are, okay, hey, this is our governing body. This is our conference. This is what we're doing. These are, this, and as opposed to it being like, oh, I started this after school program. We do, and it kind of being a one-off, and there's no system, there's no support. It's like, we are a structured, unified body that's contributing to children's success. And I don't think that's going to go away. I think that it's going to get stronger. Yes, we have to continue to fight for funding. We have to continue to advocate. But I think that with what's happened in the last year or so, people are like, okay, yeah, you're right. We do need to, step it up a little bit and make sure, you have your money. And then I hear people donating or contributing to after school programming that I feel like I didn't hear about before, or wanting to be connected, So I'm excited to stay connected until the end of time, and just kind of see the growth and be able to look back, even in my, short 15, 16 years of being in the space, of just how drastically different it is. So that's the long version.
That's the run around. That's the the up, down, in between. Hey,
right.
we got there. That's the main thing. We got there. But with good information along the way. That's the important part. That is the important part. Thank you, Kam, for that great conversation. Now it's time for our Professionals Lounge. Professionals Lounge is a segment of the show that allows guests to share advice and tips with other practitioners in the OST and youth development fields about how they can begin growing their gifts and talents, but also develop themselves as professionals in the field. Today on Professionals Lounge, I asked Kam, what type of activities should programs include in their day-to-day schedule for student engagement. Here was her response.
So day-to-day activities I like to do, and I advocate SEL check-ins. And so that can be just very simple as a question around something that's social emotional learning or social emotional learning target. So asking them a question around that. And again, just by having that on your agenda, SEL check-in, it could look a little bit different, but it's a simple thing to put on there. Okay, we know every day we're going to do an SEL check-in. If we haven't done it yet, then we haven't, done what we said we were going to do. So I think that that's critical. If we go back to what I talked about earlier, providing some kind of opportunity to move and move around, whether it be dance or fitness, or something like that, whatever makes sense for that space. Some quiet time, I think is critical, and just say, hey, even what I talked about earlier, I think having kids be quiet for too long, it doesn't always go well, and it's not always necessarily effective, but just say, hey, we're going to be very intentional. We're going to take 1 minute. We just want everybody to just have a minute of silence and just take a deep breath in, try to clear your mind, something like that, very simple, and giving them that time to just, turn off the noise. I think that's critical to do. And then something they can learn, so in terms of, even if it's an activity or, something like that. So if you're playing basketball, simply saying, oh, did you know that you can't I don't know what the ending of this is going to be, but you can't hold on to the ball for this amount of seconds over here. Right. Something just as simple as that, just teaching them the rules when they're playing free play, just shouting that out so that they've learned something. Oh yeah, you have basketball free play. Did you know? Blah, blah, blah. So again, when I go back to thinking about that lesson plan thing, just these simple little things you can throw into, okay guys, now it's free time, or okay, now you're going to, get to play sports. Let me make sure I throw in something that they can learn something and have a takeaway. Like that's big for me. And it doesn't have to be a big sit down, everybody, we're going to do a 5-point lesson on basketball in how many minutes. It's just like, hey, you could only stay in that space for 1 minute. I'm saying misinformation on that, but I'm sure, but you get the idea. It's just naming and giving them something to go along with maybe an activity, they're doing. It's easy, but then it gives that added value.
Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of our show. I would like to thank Kam for being my guest today. This was a great conversation. It had a lot of nuggets of truth, but also some great information about developing programs that I truly enjoyed discussing with you. Hopefully, we can do this again really, really soon. If you enjoyed this episode and feel you received some good information, give us a review on Apple Podcasts or visit the Podchaser website and leave us a comment. This will help us get some feedback on the show and collect testimonials for our personal website. Share us with your friends, your family, your network. Help us spread the word about how OST programs are impacting our youth as well as our communities. We can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Podcast Addict. Well, that's all I have for today. In the words of Mr. Arthur Ashe, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Until next time, bye-bye.